The issue and the theme for discussion today is resolves around is the fundamentals of integrating gender into the economics discipline. As we know, economics is one of the most exclusive to different kinds of changes and different kinds of integration of several issues. And one of the most issues to which it has been closed, one of the most significant issues to which it has been closed is that of the integration of gender, or what we call gender mainstreaming. Now today what I intend to do in the first lecture particularly is to take gender out of the social construct domain and to put it in the macroeconomic domain as a very essential part of the kinds of debates which take place, of the kinds of policies, of the kinds of structures which we analyze as social scientists. Because please remember, economics is a social science, that is a science of understanding society. And unless we take that societal, I'm not talking about social in a reductionist sense of the term, but the societal context into account, then economics really does not become a social science, and it really becomes what we call a measurement issue, or in terms of more of an engineering science than a social science. So in this context, I will talk about, the title of the lecture is Macroeconomic Underpinnings of the Gendered Work Continuum. And here I put the context of work in quotes, because the concept of work, the way it has come forward in data systems, in the way data is collected and the way work is defined, is very, very different from the kind of contribution which women really make, the economic contribution which women make in terms of their labor, and what men also make in terms of their labor to the Indian economy. I will of course be talking on theoretical issues, but primarily the databases will relate to what we do in India and the kind of movements and the trends in the gendered work continuum. Now when I use the term gendered work continuum, it covers the context of work right from within the household to outside in the public sphere. So we have what is called unpaid work within the household, unpaid care work, which is very different from unpaid work. We also have what is defined partly as paid and household work, which also will be taken into account, which is sometimes outside the threshold of the house, and of course what is actually employment, that is in the labor market, whether it is in rural areas or whether it is in urban areas. So the first issue therefore becomes contextualizing the components of what this lecture contains, what I call the conceptual underpinnings in the context of macroeconomic understanding of what is gender. Now this aspect I will follow up with what is called the gendered work participation, that is the actual data and what really it represents. And here work again is to be seen in quotes, because really what we are talking about in terms of the data systems, NSS in particular, which is the best data system which we have, is in relation to the concept of employment rather than of work. Then later on we will take up a visibilization of women's contribution in a broader context. The first and the most important aspect of the issues which need to be talked about, and that is really what we call gender mainstreaming in economic terms, is to try and understand that is gender equality being increased, and what are the implications of gender equality, and how, to what level is it integrated into every single policy, in every single program, in all sectors and at all levels. So to visibilize how gender comes at every component, whether it is transport, whether it is trade, the issue of women's role in trade, either as exporters or as importers, the issue of finance, which is extremely important, and particularly in today's context, and of course the issue of physical infrastructure. Normally the gender aspect is constrained to the social infrastructure, which is education and health, which are very important by themselves, but there's also the issue of physical infrastructure, which is very important, that are the roads being built, are the ports and the airports, or whatever other expressways, whatever other kind of physical infrastructure, dams, very much so, irrigation, does it take gender needs into account at all, and does it enhance gender equality, or does it contain and restrict the attainment of gender equality? The second component, and which is at some level talked about, where gender budgeting is concerned, this is something which has been is implemented in almost all the countries in the world, and very much so in India in the last 20 years. I think is really when we started this, that how do public expenditures, when we say public expenditures, of course it means the expenditures by the government, expenditures by the state, that do they enhance gender equality? And also, apart from the expenditure component, something on which very, very little work has been done in India, except for 1 or 2 articles, and that is the issue of revenue collection. So we have resource use and we have revenue collection, and therefore the linkages between the monetary and the fiscal architecture, which includes taxes, which includes subsidies, which includes even issues like GST and the kind of products and commodities on which the GST exists or does not exist, what it does in relation to the context of work of women, and we'll be going through various kinds of illustrations where this is concerned, and the fact that there is a two-way link between the 3 components of what we in economics understand as the macro, which is the national, the meso, which is the in-between between the macro and between the micro reflecting the ground reality. So the meso could be the region, it could be the community, it could also be the household. And I'm very consciously using the term household and not using the term family, because family is a social term and household is a very strong economic term. Now this relates to all structures, all policies, all kinds of analysis, advocacy, and very much so which we in economics we always hope to attain, and that is the issue of the kinds of policies which are created and the kind of action which is taken up at the ground level. I think the first thing we really need to understand is that we are still a developing country, and there are certain aspects of this which apply to developing countries which are quite different from countries which are much more industrialized than our country. One, and this really feeds into how the kind of economics which is taught, whether it's microeconomics or the kind of macroeconomics, when it is totally separated from or alienated from the context of gender and the context of the reality of the majority of the people. And that is that production in developing countries and also increasingly in developed countries, as we can see what is happening particularly in Europe in the context of the EU, etc., is that it is not the firm which is the unit of production, it is the family or the household which is a unit of production. That if the household is a unit of production, then the analysis at the economic level should also be at the level of the household. This, I think, if we relate to the broader level data on labor structures and production structures, it's very clear that informalization, which is increasing over a period of time, formalization, which is in that particular context decreasing, and also various other policy decisions which push production from the organized sector into the unorganized sector. And it is in the unorganized sector that people dominate, people as workers, but also women in particular much more than men do. Now, if production takes place primarily within the household, the purpose of production is obviously subsistence and survival. I think if we see the BPL or the below poverty line data, all the various reports, Arjun Sen Gupta committee report and various other reports which come from time to time, that people get into production primarily for subsistence and survival. What we say, 2 meals a day, basic education, basic health, etc. It's not so much for profit or in terms of saving for future investment, where people are concerned or where household is concerned. So if the motive for entering production or entering the labor market is subsistence, and there are levels of poverty which exist, then there is no family which can afford to be uninvolved in production or non-productive. There is no family member who can afford to be out of production, and therefore there is no woman who does not work. The problem lies with how we define what we define as work, what we define as production, and the role of women, and therefore the particular aspect where women are concerned in economy, in developed and in developing economies, as well as, of course, underdeveloped economies, is that men contribute more to production, women all to production as well as to consumption, that is consumption levels within the household or maintenance of minimum nutritional levels within the household, become primarily the responsibility of women. That is the societal role in which she is located where production is concerned. Therefore, also in relation to this is the fact that that women again are responsible for what we call the reproduction of the labor force. And here I appeal as economists that please don't see children as children in a social or as a emotional context, but children as the future workforce. And the fact that the women are very much responsible today, whether they should be or not is a different context which we will come to later, but they are primarily the ones who determine the quality of the future workforce. The last two aspects which I think we really need and we understand as economists is that we cannot see the context of economic contribution or the context of production without understanding how patriarchy is integrated into all systems of production. I'm not talking only about patrilocal, which is where the woman moves to the house of the husband, so the patriarchal locality component, or patrilineal, which is where your inheritance, etc., is concerned. But the fact that all structures are determined, and particularly economic structures, are determined by seeing women as what we call lower class, and in a very negative kind of a sense, what is seen as second class citizens. Now, within this, there are 2 or 3 examples which are very important for us to understand as economists. Part of it has been rectified, but a part of it also remains very strongly to be visibilized, to be unraveled, and to be dealt with. One and the most simplest explanation of how patriarchy is integrated into the system of production is that of dowry and versus the issue of resources or the control over property. So women's share in property is primarily seen as what is given to her as dowry. So it can be, 5 clothes, it can be 2 pairs of slippers, it can be household goods, etc. But not goods, not land, not resources, not shares, in whichever way we may define those assets, which are productive or can lead to an increase in her control over present capital and over future capital. Another illustration is the standard comments which one get both from men and for women. And here I'd just like to clarify that when we use the term patriarchy, it is a context which permeates both the thinking of both, or the ideology of both men and of women. It is not exclusive only to men. So therefore, when we talk about issues like patriarchy, or we say, and that's the first question which I always ask, is it what is the opposite of patriarchy? The answer is not matriarchy, the answer is equality. And that is something which we really have to deal with. So when we come to this issue of backward bending supply curve, that is, when does a woman work? Does she work only when the family income is not low enough, or that it is not enough to manage the household consumption and the household maintenance levels, and therefore another second earner, and therefore also this concept of a second earner or a second class citizen which is manifested itself. And the 2 statements which we always hear, that my wife does not need to work, or the woman who says that my husband earns enough to look after the family. So this backward bending supply curve which exists at some level, it is something to be broken, particularly in the context if we want to attain gender equality, that women work when they want to work, and so do men. The next issue, of course, there are many illustrations, but I just want to give you one more illustration, and that is what we again is seen as a social issue and dealt with at a social level, and that is the issue of age at marriage, which age at marriage is not again a social issue. It has an economic base, and it has huge economic ramifications, because what it implies is not just the issue of marriage, but it also implies the transfer of women's labor from one household to another household, and at what point of time this labor is going to be transferred. So therefore, perceiving patriarchy, not perceiving it outside the social construct and into what we call the macroeconomic construct. There are certain stylized facts which are very much there, because all economies are gendered. So you have your market, non-market, formal, informal, tangible, intangibles, etc. And you'll see that women dominate, men also, but women dominate much more in the non-market sector, in the informal sector, in terms of intangibles. So the focus on CPRs, or what we call common property resources, and also in terms of the levels of attainment of human development indicators, which are much lower for women, and the extent of deprivation, which are also, it's much higher where women are concerned. Whether we calculate it in terms of income or we calculate it in terms of even life expectancy, nutrition levels, IMRs, etc. Now, coming to the next component, which is extremely essential to understand, is that of the formal definition of what is work. And here what I've done is I've taken a 35-year stretch from 1977-78 to 2011-12, which is the latest when data is available, and taken what is called the work in quotes participation rate for men and for women. And as we can see, the participation of men has remained somewhat steady at about 55%, and over these 35 years, of course, there are ups and downs, but I'm not taking those minute into account. But then, as a steady line, it is from 54 to 55 over this 35 years analysis. For women, it has always been low at 30% and falling now to approximately 23%, which is one of the lowest. In fact, India is one of the 3 countries in the world where the work participation rate, as defined officially as the employment component of our existing macro data systems, that they constitute only 23%. That of all women, 23% women only work. Now, this is at the broad gendered level. If we see it at the sectoral level, which is the issue of rural and of urban, we can see very steadily from 33% 35 years ago, that is the participation of rural women, it has gone down today to 26%. There was a slight increase in 2004-5, 2007-8, and then it starts declining. And that is, I think, very, very important, the issue of greater budget sensitivity to women's issues and women's demands. In urban areas, also the work participation rate is extremely low. It was already low at 16% in 77-78, and it has come down even more during this entire period, and now it's only 11 and 12 that it increases by 0.5%, but the increase is not a very happy increase as we understand it, because it is in 2 of the most exploited sectors. One is domestic work, and or domestic labor, what we call, and the other is the issue of construction workers, which we know the situation is very problematic. At the end of this lecture, I will present to you the regional work participation rates for rural women 2004-5. This is where there is comparative. And here, please note very carefully that there are only 6 states in the entire country where the rural work participation rate has increased. 2 or 3 of these states, of course, one cannot really take seriously in quotes where rural increase is concerned, and that is partly in Goa and also, of course, Delhi, which is at a broader level what we call the broader region. There are 2 or 3 states where actually the work participation rate has increased very sharply, and these are the 2 areas where women do have a higher status historically, and also which are linked to more sustainable agriculture in particular, and that is Sikkim, which reports the highest increase of 17, not percent, but 17 percentage points, and of Tripura, which is an almost equal decrease. What the maximum increase is in Gujarat at 15 percentage points. So now you have only 27% of the women defined as workers or employed, compared to 42 a few years ago, maybe 6 years ago. The most worrying, and in fact, I think this really is one reason why a lot of us started working on this issue, that it is estimated that according to this data, is that only 5% of rural women in Bihar work. Now, in one of the poorest states, in one of the states with the lowest human development indicators, it is just not possible that 95% of rural women don't work at all. And this is a point of debate which I will be taking up in my next lecture, that what do these women do when they're not working as defined, or what they're not employed in the open labor market, then what exactly are they doing? That is the issue of the next lecture which we will be taking up. Thank you.